Welcome to LiveDaf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back. Today's Daf Yomi is Menachos Ayin Aleph. We begin on the very last line of Ayin Amud Beis. Amalei Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar turns to Rabbi Yoshia. The Rabbi Yashia, but there were two Rabbi Yashias. This one was the Dari of his generation. Rashi says his generation, his colleague, as opposed to Rabbi Yashia from way back, who was a Tana. This one was an Amira. And he approaches him with a question. He says like this. We have a Mishnah learned yesterday that the Omer will cover a grain which took root. So that's the determinant factor. If it takes root prior to the bringing of the Omer, then it's covered by the Omer, and eventually when it grows you can have it. But if it's has not taken root yet, prior to the Omer's offering, then it doesn't belong to this year's season. It doesn't relate to this year's crop. It's considered next year's growth, in which case you have to wait until next year's Omer to cover for it. That was the halach in the Mishnah. The question is the source. How do we know this? So Rabbi Elazar turns to Rabbi Yashia. He says, don't sit down until you tell me the answer. Lo tesev. Don't sit down. Akarech means your feet. Stay standing. Ad mefarshisle lamas memilsa. Until you explain to me the following halacha. Give me the source, please. Menayin lo omer shemate bash rosh. How do we know that omer permits grain which has taken root? How do we know that taking root is the precondition for linkage to the omer? Menalan. So he says in response, Minalan? What do you mean from where? Minalan? Tichsiv. Take a look at the pasuk. It says that the Omer material itself is aviv, right? Aviv means fully grown, fully mature. Aviv kali beish. Now, logic would say, explains Rashi, logic would dictate that the Omer can only be brought from material which the Omer permits, right? Let's think about it. The Omer is a representation of that material. Okay, once you bring the Omer, it covers for all and you can eat the rest. So, if, in fact, the only grain which is covered by the Omer is fully grown, fully developed, aviv, then why does the Torah have to stipulate that the Omer likewise needs to be aviv material? I mean, it's obvious. If it's coming to cover for the aviv, it itself has to be aviv. The fact that the Torah has to seek out, the Torah has to stipulate, make sure the Omer is aviv. Apparently, there is non-aviv material as well, which will be covered by the Omer. But don't bring the Omer from that. Bring it from the aviv. So there we see that even if we have non-developed grain, it's still going to be permitted by the Omer. The chsiv aviv lav mechlal, we learn from here, apparently, the ikad lav aviv, that there is other materials that are not aviv, and they're going to be permitted by the Omer. Says they were okay, fine. Not aviv doesn't necessarily mean ungrown. I mean, it could mean partially developed stalks, which haven't yet fully developed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sitting in the ground just barely taking root. I mean, that's going to taking a step, pretty far step there. Says the Gemara, V'dilma perhaps still lav aviv. I understand it's not yet aviv. Lo yom da'il shlish perhaps. The other grain, which will be permitted by the Omer, still has to achieve a third of its growth, which gives it, grain status, which makes it edible. But who says that even something less than that, less developed than that, is covered? Elam or Shmuel, rather we go to a different pasuk. Mahachal chermesh. Pasuk says that the Omer is meant to be, the first cutting. Chermesh is, the harvesting. with a sickle, right? Chermesh is a sickle. So apparently, there are other materials that are not really developed to the point of harvesting. Lav Mechlal, apparently there is the Ikad Lav Bar Chermesh. There's plenty of grain that's not ready for harvesting, which means it's still undeveloped, which means less than a third grown. Because as Rashi explains, once it hits a third, it's already technically considered harvestable. Okay, says, well, you're right, fine, it's less than a third, but it doesn't mean it's in the ground. Right, same question. Lav Bar Chermesh. I understand perhaps it's not ready for harvest. Perhaps it's still young and green, but it's already developed somewhat. Amar B'Yitzchak, Kama. Let's take a look at the pasuk again. Mehachal Chermesh Ba'Kama. The Omer material is meant to be harvested. It's standing grain. Lav Mechal de Lav Bar Kama. Apparently there's other grain that's not yet standing. It's not yet visible above ground. Not yet fully standing. Says the Gemara, okay, Vidilma, once again, Vidilma de Lav Bar Kama, perhaps it's not yet fully erect, but perhaps it's still sprouted. Agam Rashi says is something that bends over, like it's still in its grass stage, but again, it's above surface and visible. Ela Marava. So how do we know that Hashrasha, taking root, in fact, is the cutoff point? Asher Tizra. Pasuk says, this is actually by the Shtei Alechem, Rashi says, V'chag HaKatzir, Bikurei Ma'asech Asher Tizra V'asada. And Rashi explains that the Shtei Alechem and the Omer really, it's synonymous, because only material which had become permitted through the Omer will further be permitted and used by the Shtei Alechem. So it's really goes in hand. And since the pasuk references something which was planted and took root with respect to the Shtei Alechem, we apply the same principle regarding the Omer as well. So something which had been planted is already covered. Okay, so let's take it to the other extreme. Who says it needs to take root? If you're working with the Lashon Tizra, so even if it hasn't yet taken root, which is the next step, who says that's required? Amarle. So Rava responded to Rav Papa with a complimentary term. He says, Sudani. Rashi in one pshat says that Talmud Chacham has that title. Sudani is a Lashon of Soid, secret. Hashem reveals his secrets and his hidden wisdom to the Talmidim, the Talmidei Chachamim. In fact, the pasuk says, Soid Hashem l'reiv. Hashem passes on his secrets to his those who are close to him. In any case, your question is, who says it needs hashrasha? Well, basada ksiv. The pasuk says, Asher Tizra basada. It's been planted basada in the field. It's been absorbed by the field. It has taken root. Okay, so bottom line is we have a source that any grains which have already taken root prior to the Omer will be covered by the Omer and permitted for consumption that year. No, okay, now as we learned, there are two issues regarding the new grain. Chadash may not be consumed before the Omer, nor can it be harvested before the Omer is harvested. However, there are some exceptions to the rule. As we learned the other day, poor quality fields don't have to be concerned about this, because the issur with harvesting prior to Omer only applies to fields which yield quality grain, which can theoretically potentially be used for the Omer, but otherwise, if it's a poor quality situation, then you could even harvest it before the Omer. For instance, you can harvest grain off the drier fields down in the valleys where the crop is poor quality. Okay, so do that, so that it doesn't dry up and get ruined and all that. You can't pile it up. You can't turn it into into a grain pile or all that. Don't process it. Other than cutting, because that's to prevent loss. But past that point, don't wait until the Omer is brought, because there's always a concern if you're going to be involved in it, you might eat it. In this case, only harvesting is mutter, not eating, right? Until the Omer. So just do the first step, and that's it. Now, the Anshe Yericha, the people down in Yericha who lived in a valley, who were dealing with this type of inferior quality crop. So sure, Kaitzrin, they would harvest even before the Omer. But this was in accordance with the Chachamim's wishes. It was in line with halacha, as we just explained. But they went a step further. They would process their grains. This was done, as a deviation. Against the wishes of the Chachamim. But, Chacham picked their battles. They didn't make a deal about it. They didn't protest, although it was inappropriate. Here comes some more exceptions to the rule. If one decides to, cut his wheat in its young, undeveloped form, shachas is a lashon of destruction, in order to feed his animals, that is not considered an act of harvest. That's like destruction. And that's mutter before the Omer. When is that true? When he at least begins the animal harvesting, when it's still yet before a third of its growth, so it's really not even considered grain in any way. That is considered an act of destruction, not an act of harvesting, and that's allowed before the Omer. Aval, right? Reb Shimon Omer. One second. But if it's before, if it's after, if it's post shalish, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's the cutoff point. Now it's already statused and labeled as grain. In which case, harvesting this would be considered a proper harvest and not permitted until the after the Omer. Rabbi Shimon Omer takes it a step further. Yiktzar v'yachal, it can harvest and feed it, to the animals, av mishevi shlish, even if it's post a third growth, because the intended consumer is the animals. It's not really developed grain. It's just a snip. It's not really considered a harvest. More exceptions, cases where harvesting pre-Omer is permitted. We have some grain growing around the young trees, so there's overcrowding and there's loss involved. That's not considered an act of harvest. It actually gives us two reasons. He says, first of all, because it's inferior quality. That's what he says. So anything that grows between the trees doesn't really qualify for Omer material. And as we said before, that allows us to do the harvesting earlier. Another pshat in Rashi is because there's kalayim, because there's mix-up in species. So that's a mitzvah, an act of mitzvah. It's not a personal act of harvesting. Okay. Another example of a mitzvah harvest, which is allowed pre-Omer, mipnei beis ha'evel, to make room for the mourners to sit. Maybe it's a beis ha'medrash, to allow for the talmidim to come learn Torah. Now, in these cases, although we allow harvesting pre-Omer leyasos and krichos, you shouldn't turn them into tied bundles. Aval manichan tzvasim, leave them as piles, little bundles untied. We want to make it apparent that this is an exception, so that people realize that typically you don't harvest before the Omer. Mitzvah so Omer lovim menachos. Now, what about the actual Omer material itself? Preferably, it's meant to be harvested off the ground rather than taking it off the shelf from storage. He doesn't find any fresh grain to harvest. So you can use bundles that are sitting. Ideally, you should have fresh material for the Omer, as the pasuk says, caramel, rach, malay, fresh, plump. There's none available. You can even bring older, dried material. Ideally, you cut it at night between 15 and 16 of Nisan, as we learned back a couple of days ago, because the Sfiras Omer starts at the time of harvesting the Omer, and inevitably it has to be at night because you need full days, 7 full weeks. So we learned that the Sfiras Omer takes place at night. Next to Yom Kosher, if he does it by day, it's okay. Shabbos, and furthermore, harvesting of the Omer, despite it being a malacha, overrides Shabbos, as we're going to see in the Gemara. So we began with an interesting exception to the rule. Typically, you don't harvest before the Omer, but if it's an inferior quality product, that could be harvested before the Omer. What is the source for this exception? We have a pasuk, Tanya Rabbi Yomin Omer. We have an apparent contradiction between two psukim regarding this issue. Kosev echad Omer. In one pasuk it says, feel free, do harvesting, and then bring the Omer. Which sounds like you can harvest before the Omer as well, no problem. Then Uksiv, we have another pasuk which says, no, the Omer is meant to be the first harvesting. Wait until after the Omer to begin harvesting. So which way is it? Allowed or not allowed? Okay, so it all depends what type of quality material we're talking about. If it's a field that can potentially supply the Omer material, high quality produce, then you must wait patiently for harvesting until after the Omer is harvested. However, maybe a field which does not yield proper produce, which would not potentially be offered for the Omer, then you can harvest pre-Omer. But really it applies to all types of grain, all 5 primary grain. It's not a matter of what type, it's a matter of what quality. Who says? Maybe this whole Isser is limited to barley, and that's what the pasuk is delineating. Ema, perhaps we shall say, Mimin, the type, Sha'ata maybe, barley, which is meant to supply the Omer, that type of field, got to hold back from harvesting until the Omer is harvested, because that relates to the Omer, Iyata Koitzer. Mimin She'iyata maybe, let's say a different type of grain, wheat, spelt, which is not suitable for Omer material. In that case, Ata Koitzer you can harvest before the Omer. Maybe that's the difference. Well, says the Gemara, you can't even suggest as such. But Rabbi Yochanan yesterday tells us that this rule applies to all 5 grains. That's a given. We learned from Challah, right? So that's a given. So the difference must be in terms of quality. So again, bottom line is, all 5 grains should not be harvested before the Omer is harvested, unless it's inferior quality, which wouldn't be suitable for the Omer in any case. In fact, Anshe Yerichai had that type of phenomenon. Kaitzrin, they would harvest because they were living in the valley, B'Ritzon Chacham, which was okay, but they took it a step further. V'Goichin, Shalei B'Ritzon Chacham. Now, the Mishnah does conclude by saying, even though it was against the Chachamim's wishes, but they didn't make a deal, they didn't protest their activity. Now, who's known throughout Shas to have used this type of terminology? Protested, not protested. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Man shamas like the Omar Micha b'Rabbi Yehuda. Who's the one who employs this type of terminology regarding this? It's Rabbi Yehuda. And in the Mishnah we learn that according to him, it was okay for them to harvest before the Omer. Really, v'sava Rabbi Yehuda k'tzira da'anshe Yerichai. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold that the harvesting in Yerichai was okay? B'Ritzon Chacham Mavoi v'Tam you have a brayso which seems to indicate otherwise. That it was Shaloi B'Ritzon Chacham was not okay. Here comes a brayso. The following 6 customs were practiced by the residents of Yerichai, and it was split into 2 categories. Shloisha b'Ritzon Chachamim, 3 were okay. Ushloisha, and the other 3 practices were Shaloi B'Ritzon Chachamim, not in accordance with the will of the Chachamim. Ve'elo she'B'Ritzon Chachamim. What are the 3 in the first category, which were okay? Markivin Kolam Kalayim, they would graft their palms throughout the whole day. We're talking about the Erev Pesach, which are not meant to do malacha, but they considered it just a routine, not a substantial malacha, and they allowed it. The Shema, they would wrap up the words of Shema. They weren't really meticulous in their punctuations in Shema. The Kaitzin Fnei Omer, and they would harvest before the Omer, and B'Ritzon Chacham it was okay. Ve'elo Shloi B'Ritzon Chachamim. The following 3 were inconsistent with the will of the Chachamim. Goychin of Omer, they would bundle before the Omer. Umatir Gamziyah Shal Hegdish, they would allow the shearings of the trees of Hegdish, Shal Chorav Shal Shikma, the carob and Sikma trees, which were donated by individuals, and they considered only the actual original tree in its original format to be Hegdish. Anything that grows subsequently, they didn't relate to Hegdish. They held that it's not Kaddish. Of course, we disagree. But they would allow people just to take that. Shachar v'shal shikma. The 3rd item, upertz and pertzis beginners same. They had these gardens of vegetables, and they would breach it open. They would open it wide to allow poor people to come and benefit from it. Ubepardasein and their orchards, lahachal nesher laniim, to allow the poor people to come in and eat the fallen fruit. V'shnei batzeres during the years of famine. It was a big act of tzedakah, but problem is timing. The Shabbos Yom Tovim. It was open on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Chacham don't allow one to eat a fruit that fell off a tree on Shabbos and Yom Tov for concern they might go climb up and do it themselves. But they allowed it. They didn't consider it a problem. So Rav Meir's opinion is we have 6 items. 3 were in, 3 were out. Within the 3 that was in, we have the Ktsira of Fnei Omer. Rabbi Yehuda responds to him, if the first 3 items were okay, then why don't we all do it? You call out the Weissen came. The fact that we don't indicates that really all 6 items were inconsistent with the halacha. Both categories were against the chacham. It's just the chachamim chose to pick their battles. On the 3 more severe issues they opposed. As opposed to the first 3, they didn't make a big deal. But really, they're all not okay. What are the ones that are really bad? That are, inconsistent with halacha, but were not opposed by the chachamim. Markivin kolam kalayim, the grafting of the palms. V'korchan hashema. V'koitzrin v'goitchen l'fnei omer. They would harvest and process it before the omer. So let's stop for a second. Clearly, there's a steer here, because here Rabbi Yehuda seems to say harvesting of inferior quality fields before the Omer was not okay. And in the Mishnah, he seems to say it's okay. So we'll loop back to that in a minute. Okay, first let's complete the list. So we had so far 4 items, which were Shaloi B'Rtzon Chacham, which were Lo Michu B'Yadam. Ve'elu Shemichu B'Yadam, the following elicited the Chachamim's protest because of the severity of the violation. Matir and Gamzir Shalei Charv Shashikma, allowing the sharings, off the trees of Hegdish, Upertzin Pritzis Beginning Sein, Pardesein, allowing the poor to come into the fields on Shabbos, Kedei Lahachal Nishar, to eat the fallen fruit, Laniim, to feed them the fallen fruit, B'Shnei B'Tzuris, B'Shabbosos, V'M'Toivim. And here comes another item that he adds of a Noisten Peah Yarak. They would set aside Peah from even vegetables, and the halacha does not require that. So you'd ask, what's the big deal? They would be more generous. The answer is there's a flip side, there's a downside, because as Rashi explains, Peah, which is given to the poor people, is exempt from Truma and Maser. It's like Hefker. So only something which is obligated in Peah justifies giving Peah, which is exempt from Truma and Maser. Otherwise, if you're giving Peah from random things which are not really obligated, you're really doing a good thing, but also you're depriving the Kohen and Levi of their portion, of their share of Truma and Maser from that specific material. So these were considered severe violations of Micha B'Yad Chacham. In any case, let's loop back to the first part of Rabbi Yehuda's statement that Ktsira in Yerichai was problematic. In the Mishnah, he seems to say it's okay because it was inferior quality and it's allowed before the Omer. Ask the Gemara, hold it. But what about the inconsistency in the numbers? Well, Tamech, according to what you're asking, according to your version of Rabbi Yehuda's presentation, where he includes Ktsira as a problematic activity, so if you count it up, it's really 7 items, right? Well, count it up, it's really 7 items. You have the palms, you have the Shema, Kaitzun and Gaitchen before the Omer, that's 4, plus the next 3, it's a 7. And the Brisa begins with number 6, not 7. With Tamech Shisha, why is it only 6? Shiva Hava, it's really 7. So there must be something amiss. Elas Sami Mekan Ktsira, you have to delete Ktsira from here. It doesn't belong on the list. Okay, that solves the whole issue. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, really Ktsira and Yericha was okay, as per our Mishnah. What else is okay before the Omer? You can destroy, cut it young and feed it to the animals. That's not an act of Ktsira, that's an act of destruction for all practical purposes. Non Hassam. Okay, so let's elaborate on this point. We have a Mishnah back in Maseches Peah. Again, he meant to leave the corner of the field for poor people. So each field is meant to have its corner, right? Let's say you have this huge field, and you have some sort of landmark or some sort of, a stream or a river coming through the middle. That separates the field into 2 distinct entities, in which case each section requires its own Peah. It's like 2 fields. So which items are considered as separations, which items not? Velo of Sikla Peah, the following landmarks affect a separation in a field, marking it as 2 separate fields. Hanachal, or Ravina, Shlulis, like a brook, V'der Chayachid, a privately owned road, V'der Charab, a public thoroughfare, V'shvil Rab, a public pathway, Shvil Echad, a private pathway which lasts all season. So it's a proper pathway, a kavua, which is permanent, which is there throughout the summer, throughout the winter, V'abur, a strip of land which is lying fallow. Okay, so that sort of splits the field into 2, Vanir, or a strip of land which had been just plowed, not planted. Vizera Acher, a different type of plant running in the middle of the field. So you have wheat on one side, wheat on the other, and barley in the middle. Oh, Shachas. He took his combine, he ran right through his field, cut a strip right across the middle, while the grain was not yet fully grown. L'shachas, it was meant for animal feed. Mafsik, that's called an act of destruction. It's not like he started harvesting and it's just one big harvest. He destroyed the middle of his field, and now you have 2 separate fields, one on either side. Mafsik, that's Rameir's opinion. Okay, so actually the Gemara later will analyze Rameir's Shita, and will come out that according to Rameir, it's not a matter of who the intended recipient is, intended consumer. So even if he intended it for personal, human use, the fact is he cut it too early in the game. That's called an act of destruction. No, that's not considered a separation. it's considered the beginning of the harvest, unless he went and he actually plowed the area. So that's like a plowed area. It's like near. It's a new entity which creates that distinction. Okay? Bottom line is, according to Reb Meir, cutting your grain too early is deemed an act of destruction. Now you have a destroyed section within your field. Amar Rabba bar Chana. Amar Rabbi Yechon. Let's now link back to our Mishnah. Reb Meir, who says cutting it too young is not an act of harvest. B'shitas Rabbi Shimon Amra. That's following Rabbi Shimon's shita. It's in line with Rabbi Shimon, now a Mishnah. The Amar who says, likewise, regarding the prohibition of harvesting before the Omer, he says only an act of true harvest. But if you're cutting your grain too young, even if it's already past a third of its growth, technically it's regarded as grain and somewhat edible, but it's early in the game, it's not mature, it's not fully grown. If you cut it at that point, that's called an act of destruction, not an act of harvest. Shimon Amar, the Amar who tells us, before the Omer, go ahead, be my guest, go cut down your grain, even if it's already past a third of its growth. Why? Alma Kasar, apparently he holds, kol shachas, any sort of abnormal harvest, laftziri, cutting it too young, cutting it too early in the game, is not considered an act of harvest. Laftziri. So the Gemara links together the heter of doing this young harvest before the Omer to the halacha of Peah, where it creates that hefsek. It's not considered a harvested area, it's a destroyed area. Yosef Rabbah, he was sitting with Carmel Shmaita saying over this analogy, this connection between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon and now Mishnah. He had a question. He says, take a look at the next brisa. It's a Tosefta. Which elements create a separation in a field regarding Peah? Let's say grasshopper came along and just consumed a strip of the field. Kirasimon and or ants, chewed it up from the bottom and felled it like that. So it wasn't a proper, conventional mode of harvesting. Shvarata ruach, the wind came and knocked down, a strip of grain. All agree, we deem it as an active harvest. It's not considered like a destroyed section of your field, irrespective of the mode of harvest. Hakol Moedim all agree, even Rameir agrees. Charash, mafsik, only if he plowed it and he turned it into a plowed area, that's a new type of entity. But loy charash ain't a mafsik. So only if it's charash it's masa, but otherwise, the fact that it was picked in this abnormal way, it's considered an active harvest. It's not a destroyed area. Now, Hakol Moedim, we say all agree, man, who are we trying to cover? Rameir, even Rameir, who considers it a mafsik before, but not in this case. Why? What's the difference? We have to reconcile this apparent contradiction. There he said that kaisel shachas, an abnormal cutting, is an act of destruction. It makes a hefsek in the field. And here he says not. So it seems that the only solution would be if we separate the cases as follows. We say, look, over there we're talking that it's still very, very undeveloped. It's under a third of its growth. That's an act of destruction. It's not suitable for harvesting at all. But here we're talking that it was harvested after it grew that to the point of a third. So somewhat it's considered grain, and therefore, even though it was cut in an abnormal way, it's considered an act of tzira. It's considered the beginning of your harvest. If you'll agree to separate the cases and explain and interpret that the initial Mishnah there is talking that it's still too young and undeveloped, before a third of its growth, and therefore it's considered an act of destruction and makes a hefsek in the field, Bryce, as opposed to the recent Bryce, which does not consider a hefsek. The charashin, this last Bryce, which says only if you plowed it, it's a hefsek, but otherwise it's not a hefsek. We're speaking that the grain has already developed to the point of a third, so it's technically suitable for harvesting to a certain extent. So then, it would explain why it's deemed as such. Elo, Amris, Mas Nisan, Nami, B'Shei V'Shlish, but according to our earlier contention, that according to Rav Meir, even once it reaches a third, still too young, too mature for harvesting, and therefore it's considered an act of shachas, act of destruction, which is in line with Reb Shimon now Mishnah, who says that even once it gets to a third, it's still considered an act of destruction. Okay, but how could you reconcile the most recent brisa, which says that according to Reb Meir as well, even if it was felled by a wind, by grasshoppers, it's considered an act of tzira? How does that work? Hashta, look, even in that first Mishnah, the tzira, where he took his combine, he took a sickle, it was a proper, cut, proper harvest. Still, Amar Reb Meir, lo yishma tzira, it's not regarded as a harvest, because it's not ready for harvesting. Hachal koshken, certainly in the brisa where the ants got a hold of it, the grasshoppers, of course it should not be considered. So it's sort of stuck. Ella says the Gemara, rather, let's take a different route. Reb Meir b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda Amra. Reb Meir will follow Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, who says it depends how developed it is. Below a third is destruction. Above a third is harvesting. And that will also reconcile the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa here. Depends at what state he harvested it. The Amar tells us, right? So again, it's b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda Amra. The Amar Imasai. When do we say harvesting unfinished grain is considered destruction? When at least he began the process before it reached the third. But if he waited until a third, also you can't do it before the Omer. It's considered katsira, and the same here, considered harvesting. Hold it, says the Gemara. Who is the intended consumer according to Rabbi Yehuda? It would appear from the Mishnah. Take a look at the Mishnah. It says, "Koitel l'shachas machal behema." The shachas was intended for animal feed, so we take the intended consumer into account. So we have two conditions. It's got to be below a third in terms of the grain value. In terms of the consumer value, it has to be for the animal. Right? Rabbi comes and explains a masai. In addition to the consumer condition, you need the grain condition as well, meaning it has to be below a third. Two conditions have to be met for it to be regarded as an act of destruction. Right? That's clearly Rabbi Yehuda's shita. Or apparently Rabbi Yehuda's shita, right? It's true that Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's an act of destruction because it's for animal feed. But if it's intended for a person, for human use, who's to say that he would agree? In fact, it would seem from the Mishnah that he doesn't agree. That is considered destruction. Because otherwise, you'll end up with three opinions in the Mishnah, which doesn't seem like that from the Mishnah. Because take a look back at the Mishnah. Let's flip back for a second, right? So the Mishnah says, you can feed it meant for the animals. And it's not considered ksira, it's mutar before the omer. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, a masai. And a masai, Rashi explains, is merely explaining, is elaborating. He's not arguing, he's explaining, meaning I agree to that first condition. The end consumer must be the animal. Furthermore, in terms of the development of the grain, it must be below a third for it to qualify for to be considered an act of destruction. And Reb Shimon adds, well, even a third. Right? There were no three opinions here. There's no like Tanakama was saying it's meant for the animals only, and Rabbi Yehuda says, you don't have to reckon that condition. It's all just a matter of how developed the grain is. Then Reb Shimon, which will be three shitas. It doesn't say like that from the Mishnah. It must say just explaining the earlier statement. If that's the case, Rabbi Yehuda has another condition. Below a third growth, and also the intended consumer. It has to be for the sake of the animals. Whereas Reb Meir does not stipulate that as a condition. He says as long as it's being cut early, it's considered destruction. So it's sort of out of luck here. Ella, Kiyasar Rav Dimi, Amar. Rather, Rav Dimi came and explained, I'll find you a shita who Reb Meir aligned himself with. Reb Meir b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Amar. Reb Meir aligned himself with his Rebbe Rabbi Akiva. The Amar says, Af la'adam, nami la'aktir, even if it's meant for a person, meant for human consumption. If it's done in an abnormal way, cut too young, cut too... it's considered lo yav ktsira. It's an act of destruction. It's not ktsira. Okay, where do we find Rabbi Akiva? It's not Hamanamer. Menamer, he leopards his field like a leopard that has the spots. So he basically alternated. For some reason, he decided to cut one row, skip the next one, cut the third one. Okay, so he's spotting up his field. Hamanamer sada v'shir by klachem lachem, left behind the rows whose grain was not yet still young and moist. It was still raw and not yet ready for harvesting. Rashi explains, of course, if we're talking about a regular field, which is fully grown and fully ready for harvesting, so even if he does this funny act, formation of harvesting, it doesn't matter. It's one big harvesting. It's all one act of ktsira. It's one field, and there's only one peah that he gives from the corner at the end of the day, and that's it. But here, the other grain that he left behind wasn't ready for harvesting. So what happens now? Do we consider each section as a separate section regarding peah, like a separate field? Each one is a separate harvest. Each section is deemed separately. Right? Because as we explained, if it's an abnormal harvesting process, it's considered like destruction to a certain extent, and it's not considered the initiation of the full harvest. So each section has its own status, its own entity. No, they said the whole field is one entity, so just give peah, in one area, that takes care of everything. He explained like this, that when do we say each section is separate? That's only when he harvested, that whatever he took was not really ready. It was still young and moist and not, fully. Rashi actually says it was less than a third in its growth. Right? So it's not really ready for harvesting. How's he going to eat it? Klayas, they turn it into roasted, wheat, and that's how they eat it. Aval ben menamer lo yitzer lo, but if it's fully grown, and it's just, harvesting it section by section in this funny way, but end of the day it's fully grown and it's loitzer, it's meant for storage, it's perfectly fine grain, fully grown. So then we wouldn't separate the sections, it's ready to be harvested, and this is the way he's harvesting. The whole field, it's one act of harvest and it's one entity. Oh, so we found our source. We located our source. Here we have a sheet of Rabbi Akiva. A young harvest is not considered a proper harvest, even if it's intended for personal human consumption. That's like Rabbi Meir, who says likewise, a young harvest is not considered an act of harvest, even though the intended consumer is an Adam. However, as we explained before, even according to Rabbi Meir, but if it's already properly developed wheat past the third, then of course Rebbe would agree it's considered an active harvest, because the grain itself is somewhat suitable for harvesting. Says the Gemara, behold it, I'll show you that according to Rabbi Akiva, even if it's fully grown, fully developed, but if it's harvested in this funny way, abnormal way, section by section, because the other one wasn't ready yet, so each one is deemed a separate harvest and not a proper harvest. Says the Gemara, is that so? Ki also Ravin, Rabbi Yochanan, he explained, Mechayev, Rabbi Akiva would apply the same principle, the same sort of separate principle to consider each section separate, because it's not considered a proper harvest. It's considered somewhat like an act of destruction. Even if the grain is ready to go, ready for storage. Why? Because this wasn't really a proper harvest. Typically you harvest the whole field as one when it's all ready. Here we grabbed a piece from here, waiting for everything to to develop and to grow. So since some sections are not fully developed, it's not considered a proper harvest, despite the fact that what he did take is ready to go. That's not like Rabbi Meir, who says that if it's ready to go, it's considered an active harvest. Says the more you're right. Rabbi Meir picked and chose. He adopted Rabbi Akiva's opinion part way. Yes, regarding young grain, and not regarding fully developed grain. On the one hand, he agreed with Rabbi Akiva. It's less than a third in growth. You take it off, it's considered destruction, even if it's intended for a person. On the other hand, he disagreed with him regarding the fully mature wheat. Rabbi Akiva considers it non-tzira in this circumstance. Rabbi Meir says, no, once it's past the third, since on account of the grain it's somewhat ready, so whatever happens is considered an act of tzira. Okay, let's recap today's daf. The Omer permits the new crop for consumption, provided the new crop took root before the Omer was brought. Typically, we don't harvest before the Omer, unless it's a field of inferior quality, which wouldn't be suitable for the Omer anyways, and that's learned from Pasuk. That's exactly what happened in Yerichai. Some exceptions to the rule would be harvesting for the sake of mitzvah, harvesting for shachas. What exactly constitutes shachas? We have two shittas in the Mishnah. So it's meant for the animals, but how undeveloped is it? According to one shitta, specifically under a third. According to the other shitta, Reb Shimon, even above a third. And according to Reb Meir, it's sort of a third shita that has to be below a third, provided, and even if it's not intended for animal use, even for Adam use. But since it's being cut prematurely, we don't deem it as an act of tzira, rather an act of destruction. It has two applications. One regarding permitting the tzira before the Omer, and secondly regarding splitting up the field into two distinct sections regarding payah. Okay, all the best to you, and Atzlacha Rabbah.